Hello, I'm Matt Galloway, and this is the Current Podcast.
Wikie and Keijo may be set to make a big move from the French Riviera to Nova Scotia. The two orca whales currently live in a marine park, but could be the new inhabitants of the first ever whale sanctuary in Port Hilford, about 2 hours outside of Halifax. A nonprofit called the Whale Sanctuary Project is leading the effort.
They will have depth to dive, which they typically do not in a concrete tank. And so we designed the sanctuary to promote as many natural behaviors and allow the residents to live as whales.
Amy Simon is the communications assistant for the Whale Sanctuary Project. She runs the visitor center in the area. It's a place for the community to come in and ask questions.
It's a really big deal. Like when you take a small little area like Guysborough County, it's huge. It's not every day that you have sanctuary and the fishing industry come together for the greater good, but it's happening here in Guysborough County, and it's quite magical to see.
Charles Vinnick is the executive director of the Whale Sanctuary Project. He's with us this morning from his home in California. Charles, hello.
Good morning, Nahlah. Thank you.
Thanks for being here. Where did the idea for this sanctuary come from?
Well, it actually started a number of years ago in 2015 and 16. Lori Marino, who you heard moments ago, Dr. Marino was at a meeting in Washington State, and a number of people were talking about how we can do a better job treating and caring for animals, cetaceans that are in captivity. And out of that meeting came the concept for a whale sanctuary, and these years later, all of the work that has gone into working towards creating one in Port Hilford, Nova Scotia.
And what was the thinking behind needing to have one?
There are a number of reasons. One being that we are seeing around the world more and more concern about the ways in which animals, both on land and in the sea, are kept in captivity. We've seen a major change, circuses no longer having elephants perform. There are now sanctuaries for big cats, for elephants. And I think out of that has also come concern for how cetaceans are in marine parks and aquariums, sometimes well kept, but often in environments that are not conducive to their thriving for the lifetimes that they have. And in the case of orca whales, they live the same life in many ways, the same length of life as we do as humans. So there's a desire to treat them differently and return them to as close an approximation to what they are born and what they have evolved to live in than we possibly can.
So I'd love to relate that thought and that notion to the location that was chosen. Why Nova Scotia? Why is that chosen as a location for the sanctuary?
Well, we looked at over 130 sites in Washington State, British Columbia, and Nova Scotia, and we found this one met all of the environmental questions that we had. It had good flushing. It's a bay that we can net a section of 100 acres, 40 hectares of space in water. So it provides an environment that works really well. And as Amy Simon said, what we have is the community welcoming us, and you don't find that in every environment.
Charles, when did you start working with whales?
I had the privilege of working with Jacques Cousteau and the Cousteau family for more than 30 years. My first interaction with them with whales was probably 45 or 50 years ago.
Wow.
And then certainly the most significant experience I had was managing the project to bring the Free Willy whale, Keijo, back to his natal waters in Iceland and spending 4 years with him, which was the first project really to experiment whether a whale could be returned to the wild and be reintroduced to a pod. And in that experience, what we learned is how difficult it really is to put one back into the wild.
That's extraordinary. That means most of us, or many of us, are familiar with your work already. But now there are a couple of names I want to bring into the mix. Wikie and Keijo. Who are they?
Well, Wikie is Keijo's mother. They were born in captivity in a marine park in southern France, Marineland Antibes. And under French law, they need to be moved by 2026.
And why is that?
That's because the law in France has said no longer will France allow keeping whales and dolphins in captive environments. We have proposed to the French government that the sanctuary in Nova Scotia is an appropriate place for them to be moved, and a better place than sending them to an even smaller aquarium than where they have been all of their lives in Antibes.
Now, the French government was expected to announce a decision on where the whales should go in June, but French President Emmanuel Macron called a snap election. And I wondered what that meant for the fate of the whales.
Well, it certainly has delayed it. We've been in touch with the French ministry, and what will happen, and we saw with the elections this past Saturday and the follow-up election that will be this coming weekend, that the government is likely to shift to the right, meaning for this purpose, all of the ministers will change. So exactly who will make the decision now is not known.
So tell me what this proposed sanctuary looks like in Nova Scotia. How does it work?
Well, if you kind of close your eyes and picture a bay, horseshoe-like bay and the like, that's the ideal sanctuary. It's very hard to find the perfect site. In this case, we're in a very large bay called Indian Harbor. Locals call it Port Hilford Bay. And there's a section of it that is protected by an island. And we would net off 100 acres from the island back to the mainland. And within that area, we would also have a very large bay pen, which would be the environment that the whales would first come to so that they can get used to being in a larger environment they've been, but still with a level of protection that doesn't give them the whole 100 acres, so that we take every step very slowly. We will have 24/7 animal care staff. We will have a full-time veterinarian. We will have marine operators. We have all of the personnel that care for the whales and care for the environment we have constructed for them. And hopefully even some of the trainers who've been working with them all of these years come with them to the new environment, because those are the people that they actually trust and who trust them. And that trust among the caregivers and the whales is critically important.
It sounds like it might be a very costly endeavor.
It's very costly. This would be all in $16 to $18 million, which sounds like an extraordinary amount of money, and it is, but it is less than it would cost to build them a new environment in a marine park where the tanks are already failing. And that is part of the reason that Marineland Antibes has also decided they can no longer keep the facility running that they have.
And speaking of cost, how would you actually move these massive animals to the sanctuary?
They would be moved by plane. That is the way we moved Keiko from Mexico City to Oregon and eventually from Oregon to Iceland. So you have experts who are experienced in doing so, and that's all part of the logistics.
We're going to bring in another voice now into the conversation, Charles. So just stay with us and we'll come back to you. We'll bring in Professor Andrew Treitz, who is a UBC professor and director of the Marine Mammal Research Unit at the Institute for the Oceans and Fisheries. Good morning, Andrew.
Good morning.
As you're listening here with us, I'm wondering what your biggest concern is when it comes to opening a whale sanctuary in Port Hilford, Nova Scotia.
First off, my hat is off to the sanctuary project. There's a need for this type of sanctuary. My biggest concern is the location. Why Nova Scotia? Now, I grew up in Nova Scotia. My dad was an oceanographer, and I remember some of those storms.
Yeah.
I currently live in British Columbia, where we have a very benign environment in terms of winter storms, a lot more protected water. So my first concern is whether or not such a facility that seems so exposed can actually survive.
Do we have any research as to whether whales can withstand weather such as that?
It's one thing for the whales to withstand that. That should not be an issue. It's really not whether or not the structure that's going to hold them can stand up to that. So we have, for example, we know with climate change, they're just more and more severe storms. They're more frequent. They're like things we haven't seen before. There's also issues with icing. That's a problem in the wintertime. And certainly during the summer, you're going to have a lot of fouling of nets. That's when you get everything from algae growing on netting to mussels. And then you just have the year-round corrosion that deals with anything near salt water. So I just see a number of things here which are like red flags for me in terms of its location, which makes me wonder, hopefully they would try to run the facility for at least a year with no whales just to be sure they can maintain this infrastructure.
Can you talk about what it takes to maintain a marine facility like this?
Well, I've never taken anything of this scale. But in British Columbia, I did set up an open water research station. We were set up in Port Moody, which is near Vancouver, and it was a floating pen system with 4 adult stellar sea lions. For this very small facility, we ran it for, I guess, just over 10 years. It was one where there's just constant maintenance. And I know it was something that I had initially not budgeted or considered. The other thing was that we had a very, very protected site. And even in protected sites, there were lots of days, big winds and lots of motion that could ultimately damage things and needed repairs. But we had a very, very good site near a big urban center, which also gave us other sources of support that we needed on occasion.
I imagine you have some sense of what it takes for a whale raised in captivity to adapt to the wild. Could you speak to how difficult a process that is?
I think, as Charles was saying, that with the proper support, if they could bring their trainers with them, they'll be able to adapt. It will certainly be a very, very different environment for them. The whales will probably still need to have a lot of interactions. They are social animals. Their pod has become people. They can become quite lethargic and depressed if they're not kept stimulated and intellectually engaged. But these are all things which Charles and his team are very aware of, and steps can be done to ensure they have a very enriched environment.
So ultimately then, Andrew, I just wonder if you could explain if, many countries have banned whales in captivity, including Canada. So what would be the best option for remaining captive whales and dolphins, if not a sanctuary like this?
Well, I think the only other option would be to see them go to another facility that currently has whales. I don't see that there is any other option for them. Ultimately, though, I'm left with the question of who is responsible for these whales. This project is not going to be bringing cats and dogs with short lifespans to Nova Scotia. And bringing a whale, it's like adopting a child. You can't return them if they turn out to eat more or cost more to house them than what you expected. And the thing with killer whales is that they live a long time. Males can live 30 to 60 years, females 50 to 90 years. Wow. So my question would be, will the people of Nova Scotia be ultimately responsible for the long-term care?
Andrew, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you.
That was UBC Professor Andrew Treitz. He is also director of the Marine Mammal Research Unit for the Institute of the Oceans and Fisheries. So let's go back now to Charles Vinnick, Executive Director of the Whale Sanctuary Project. Hello again, Charles.
Hello again.
Charles, what do you make of Andrew's concerns about the sanctuary?
Well, I think Andrew has presented strong and important concerns that we should all listen to and consider. Everything Andrew has said are issues that every sanctuary will face, and that certainly we in our team have looked at and continue to look at. In our site, we've actually experienced 2 hurricanes on site already. We have made sure we do testing of waves, currents, and the environment during those storms. And as Andrew pointed out, those are not concerns really for the animals. It is for the people and for the infrastructure. So you have to have as large a team or larger always working on the infrastructure as you do in caring for the animals. And all of that is part of both the budget for building the structure, the capital investment, as well as the annual maintenance.
So there was the concern about how the weather affects the actual sanctuary, but what about the animals themselves, the whales? I wonder how you'll ensure, or what's going to be done to ensure that they adapt to those winters coming from a climate like the French Riviera.
Well, I think what I mentioned earlier is you do everything slowly. In the 6 or 7 months, once a decision is made, but before the whales are moved, you begin to take steps to introduce them to things they will see in their new environment. You introduce some plants and the like that they'll see and feel in the new environment. You begin to reduce the temperature in the environment where they are, and then you plan to move them, not in the winter, but move them in the summer so that they can experience the gradual change in the water temperature slowly and appropriately so they get used to it.
Andrew also raised kind of the bigger question of whose responsibility the whales are. I mean, the fact that they have such long lifespans. I think the way he put it was, will the people of Nova Scotia be ultimately responsible? And if not, who will be?
We, as the Whale Sanctuary Project, take full responsibility for the whales and have to have the funding and the path for long-term funding in order to move the project forward. The people who should have some responsibility are the people who have made millions of dollars for their display, and there should be a retirement program for whales like this, just as there is for humans, because that's actually what we're doing. We're retiring the whales, but that's not the case. So we have to take responsibility for them, and we owe it to them. We owe them something back because we as humans have taken them from the wild, and we have a responsibility to care for them for their lifetimes.
Part of that, taking them from the wild, has left the whales growing up interacting with humans. How do you address the question that Andrew raised, whether they will get enough stimulation in an environment like the sanctuary?
We have to provide the same level of stimulation that they've always had before. That's why you bring a care team, new employees, and those that have been with them before, so that they have that same kind of human-whale interaction and stimulation. But in addition to that, they have all the stimulation of the natural environment. With Keiko in Iceland, what we saw is he would chase birds across the bay. He would find plants. He would find a crab and bring it up and play with it. He had the storms. If there was a big storm, we may be holding on to the edge of the bay pen because of the winds and the waves. He's out there frolicking, if you will, in it. And you can't but be impressed with the way in which the natural environment provides a stimulation that we as caregivers and trainers can never provide.
The idea ultimately, Charles, is that eventually this sanctuary will be home to more than just Wikie and Keijo. What's your vision for the sanctuary in the long term?
Well, the way you determine the number of animals that any environment, a sanctuary, can hold is by the carrying capacity, if you will, of that environment. In other words, whales poop. You've got to make sure that the environment is such that it is self-flushing, that it cleans itself. So all of that is part of the hydrodynamic testing that went into selecting this particular site. So we would picture roughly 8, maybe 10, depending on the animals, who they are, their size and the like, being a maximum number of animals in a 100-acre sanctuary, which this is.
Yeah. In the end, this project has been delayed quite a bit, and it was originally announced back in 2020. How soon do you think you can get whales into the sanctuary?
The plan that we have presented to the French government is to bring Wikie and Keijo in 2025, so next year, to the sanctuary. Now, that's a tall order, but we have put in place all of the work that's necessary to meet that timeline, and we're on target right now with the work we're doing.
Once that happens, Charles, what is it that Nova Scotia gains in having this sanctuary, in having it there?
Well, of course, there are some immediate benefits of some jobs. There are certainly the environment and the like. But I think what Nova Scotia gets and what Canada gets and what, in some ways, the world gets is the satisfaction that we're doing what's right. I mean, in many ways, I think of some of the Indigenous people who have worked with us on this project, and they always ask, if you could ask the whales, what would they say? Mm. And they might say, well, gee, no, let's stay in a concrete tank. Mm-hmm. But I think all of the Indigenous people who often believe that the whales are our ancestors who live beneath the waves naturally say that the whales would say, yes, let's try this. Let's do it. Is it different? Yes. Are there risks? Of course. But there are risks in everything the animals experience in the wild. There are risks to all of us every day. We need to do what's right, and we need to come together globally to help these whales that have been in captivity.
Charles, thank you so much for sharing with us today.
You're welcome. Thank you for having me.
Charles Vinnick is the executive director of the Whale Sanctuary Project. The world's first whale sanctuary is being proposed in Port Hilford, Nova Scotia.